Greetings, my name is Brian Guthrie, aka Guthron. The thesis that drove my research is as follows. Did the concept of American superiority stemming from American exceptionality make its way into the sermons of the 18th and 19th century and then have a deleterious effect on the congregations in regards to how they treated minorities, essentially non-whites? This can include blacks and, of course, Native Americans. As I began my research, coupled with the work from another class, I found that the specific topic was losing interest for me. While I was still interested in studying the sermons and actions of American Christians from the 18th and 19th century, our studies of Puritans and their concepts of duty and communal living, coupled with what I was learning in the other course that I'm studying, redirected my interest towards other effects that American Christians had on the culture of the United States in the 19th century. Specifically, I became interested with the concept of the American warrior culture, the honor of dying in battle, and the negative effects that that has on American soldiers and the civilians who had to live with them. However, that topic kind of went rather wide afield. It wasn't hard for me to find evidence of Christians using the concept of racism to justify their actions as they expanded westward. One need look no further than how they treated the slaves and the Native Americans, as I mentioned earlier. The atrocities committed against Native Americans are very well documented. Justifications used by American Christians in helping to not just murder Native Americans, but to systematically wipe out their culture often stemmed from what Christians argued was the need for their salvation. The history of European settlement in North America is rife with European Americans, as they eventually became known, disregarding the cultures of the Native Americans, assuming that they had none, that they were simply a primeval, earlier type of society that was in desperate need of European civilization to drag them into the next era of civilization. The justifications that these Christians were using drew my interest almost immediately, as many of them paired nicely with my studies in my other class of the effects of combat trauma on soldiers and civilians. When we were studying the Puritans earlier this semester, I became further interested in the long-term effects that Puritan culture had on the development of not just American society as a whole, but on the fighting culture that came as the nation essentially birthed itself from combat. As the 19th century played out, it became very obvious through studies that American culture at large, but in particular American Christianity, had no concept for how to deal with the consequences of their actions. One finds justifications in the beyond for many actions taken in this world. As I said previously, finding the connections between American Christians, their sermons, and the racism that was prevalent during the 19th century and before and after was not difficult at all. Some of the most famous preachers of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century struggled with many of the concepts that the rest of the nation struggled with, including slavery. George Whitefield, for example, turned out to be a strong advocate for the chattel slavery system and helped establish it in the colony of Georgia. Richard Furman, considered by many to be the most important Baptist leader prior to the Civil War, began as a strong opponent to slavery, then fell silent on the subject, and then later in his life spoke out against just simply tearing down the system. It does not require much research to find Christians in the 19th century American society basically being hypocrites on what they believed and what they taught and what they executed when it came to other people. We see this even more so in the post-Civil War Jim Crow era heading into the 20th century and the eventual Civil Rights Act. However, as I said, with my research moving towards a different focus with the American church, that's a bit of a rabbit trail now. Having completed the amount of research I already have under this topic, I will continue down this road long enough to complete the project for this class. However, I think I've decided to shy away from leaning on the overt evidence of Christians using their faith to justify racist actions and simply lean towards the sermons, some of the evidence therein of how they were basically teaching entire congregations to think of themselves as above the rest. But even that's a little bit of a large topic to study. In the end, I think I've decided to fall back on some of the stuff we studied earlier with the Puritan culture, the Quakers, and the advent of the, for lack of better words, the massively diverse Baptist movements of the 18th and 19th century, to focus on how American culture was developed around the, for lack of a better term, not to use that too much, a Puritan push towards a specific society built on the, honestly, the European myth of what the chosen people were. I mean, that specific concept goes back to the foundations of the colonies in New England with John Winthrop and his City on the Hill speech or sermon. Essentially, I don't want to lose the research time that I spent on this, but I want to redirect it towards what is becoming the initial ideas for my dissertation to be completed later. It's very important to me that I don't waste these classes researching small projects that aren't connected, as I did through most of my master's degree. I want all of these classes and all their assignments to build on that research, and with my other class and my 2 new classes all allowing me to focus more on the topic of combat trauma, specifically in the 19th century, and how American culture and society just were not prepared. They weren't mature enough, the knowledge wasn't there, and essentially the culture of the time forced people who had experienced trauma to hide what they were going through. With all of that shift, it feels better to me to take what I got from the research for this assignment, combine that with some of the stuff that we got from earlier assignments in this class, and create a project. Well, not necessarily create a project, but focus the project on that topic, because one way or the other the topics are connected. American exceptionalism, the concept of manifest destiny of a chosen people, is hardwired into American society during the 18th and 19th century. As much deconstruction of the concept as has happened over the last 100 years, when one studies the early decades, really, of the American nation, you cannot miss the overt influence of that Puritan concept of we are the, if nothing else, spiritual heirs of the nation of Israel.